Lesson 31. Identify points, lines, line segments, and rays. Study the example that shows a drawing with points, lines, line segments, and rays. Then solve problems 1 through 9. Example. Amy made a drawing of a letter A in her math notebook. Use geometry words to describe the drawing. There are 4 points on the drawing. Point A, point B, point C, and point D. There is a line segment from point B to point D, so that's from B to D. There is a line through points A and C, so that's going straight across. The line goes through A and C. There is a ray from point B through point A. So going from this point at B through to A. Before we start on number 1, let's look at the vocabulary. Remember, a point is a single location in space. So this is an example. It's just like a dot or a period, but it's called a point with math, and then it's labeled with a letter. So this is point B. Line segment. A straight row of points that starts at one point and ends at another point. So a line segment has 2 points at the beginning and at the end. So it stops here and stops here. So this would be line segment BD. A line is a straight row of points that goes on forever in both directions. So that's why with this one I said it stops here. Notice that there's not an arrow saying that it continues in this direction. But for a line, both points A and C have that arrow showing that it continues in both directions. So if it has 2 points at each end, it's a line segment. If it has the points and shows the arrows that the line continues, that's what makes it a line. Ray, a straight row of points that starts on one point and goes on forever in one direction. So it's important to know for a ray that it's only going to continue in one direction. So go back to a segment, it doesn't continue in either direction because there are no arrows on each end. A line will continue in both directions. So it's continuing in this direction and in that direction. But for a ray, it only continues in one direction. So notice how there's only an arrow pointing off to this side. So it continues that way. But this side does not. It stops here. Okay, so number 1 says how many lines are in the drawing. Remember, a line continues in both directions, arrows on both ends. There's only one line in this drawing, and it starts here at A, and it continues on the other end at C. This point B and E, that would not be a line because it stops at this point B. It doesn't continue going. So the only line here is from A to C across the bottom there. And you'll write a line just like they wrote it up here at the top. So you write the 2 letters, the part where it starts and the part where it ends, which would be A over to C, and then you label it on top with a very small line. And remember to put arrows on both ends. That's what tells us that it is a line. Number 2, how many rays are in the drawing? So going back, a ray has 1 point at one end where it stops, and then the other end has an arrow where it continues. So if we look at this drawing and you start at B, that's a point that it stops at, and it continues over to A, and you see the arrow here saying A continues on in that direction. So from B to A, that's a stopping point, and then a part that continues on in one direction. So that would be a ray. So from B to A would make 1 ray. B to D would make 2 rays. B to E would make 3 rays, and B to C would make 4 rays. Number 3, write the name of the line in the drawing. So that goes, oh, I made a mistake on number 1. We're not supposed to write the name. That's what would go down here on number 3. Up here it just says how many, and that's 1, so only 1. And then the name of it is what we did at the top, AC. So it starts at A, it finishes, or the other point, the other side of it is C, and you label it on the top by drawing a little line. So number 1 just said how many are there. There's only 1, so the answer to number 1 is 1. And then writing the name of that line would be on number 3, so AC. Number 4, write the names of the rays in the drawing. So that's what we just looked at. We've got one side that stops and one side that continues. So we're starting with B and it continues to A. So that would be B, A, and then at the top, so if you look back at this example, you draw a little ray on the top of it, which means it only has an arrow on one end. So that's for BA. The next one is BD. And then BE. And B to C. Number 5, look at the shapes the shape at the right. How many line segments are in the shape? So going back over here, a line segment is where a line starts and stops. It has a starting point and a stopping point. And if you were to go to this shape and put points, remember a point is just, it's like a dot, at each of the parts where 2 of them meet, then it would be easier to see each line segment. So from this top corner to the bottom, that is a start and a stop that does not continue. So that would be 1 line segment. From this point to this point would make 2 line segments, and we'll just work our way around. So from this point to this point, it's 3 line segments. From this point to this point makes 4. From this point to this point is 5. And from this point to this point is 6. So there are 6 line segments in this shape. Number 6, label each sign below. Write line, line segment, or ray. So remember that a line is something that continues in both directions. So if it's one line with arrows at both ends, that makes it a line. When you look at these signs, this third sign shows that. You've got one line and it's got an arrow at both ends. So this would be an example of a line. Now, there are 2 other ones that have arrows. This second one and then the last one have arrows, but those lines, it's 2 different lines. The arrows aren't at the end of the same line. So that's why those aren't examples of lines. Think about what those would be examples of though. You've got one end without an arrow and one end with an arrow for each of those, and then the same down here. One end with no arrow, an arrow on this end, no arrow, and arrow. So think about which that would be an example of: a point, a line segment, a line, or a ray. So the correct answer is a ray, because remember, a ray has one end that goes on forever in just one direction. So we've got a point at one, an arrow at the other end. And that's what these are examples of. No arrow on this end, arrow here, and then the same thing. So these would be examples of rays, because those lines only continue in one direction. Now, the last 2, I don't see any arrows on. So if you look back at our vocabulary box, this is what that would be an example of. There's no arrows at either end, which we would call that a line segment. See how there are no arrows on either ends of these lines. Okay, number 7. Look at the drawing below. Choose yes or no to tell whether each line, line segment, ray, or angle is shown in the drawing. A says X, Y, and it's saying X, Y, an arrow on each end, would be a line. So we need to find X and Y in this drawing. So here's X and here's Y. If you look, X continues in this direction, and then at point Y, the line continues in that direction. So X, Y, since they continue in both directions, that is a line. So we would check yes. B has X and Z. Here's point X, here's point Z. Those two aren't even on the same line or line segment. So those 2 points, this is saying that they are a line, but they are not, because they are not even at the same part or on the same line of this drawing. So that would be no. C says WX. So we're looking here at W and here at X. C says that WX is a ray because it's got the arrow on one end but not on the other. So if you look at X, X does not have an arrow. X is a stopping point. So one end is stopping right here, X. It does not continue on. However, with W, it does continue on. So with X being a stopping point and W continuing on, only in that one direction, this would be a ray. So check yes. D, Y and X. It's saying Y and X over here. It says YX is a ray. So this is telling us that one end is a stopping point and one end continues forever when we're looking at Y and X. If we go over here, we see Y, but Y continues on. It does not stop. And if we look at X, X also continues on. So Y continues in this direction and X continues in this direction, and they are continuing in 2 directions, where this is saying it's only continuing in one direction. So that would not be true. That would be no. Now, E, notice that on top of ZY, there are no arrows. So what that means is this is saying ZY is a line segment with no arrows on either end. So if we look over here at Z and Y, Y does stop. Y is a stopping point because it doesn't continue in this direction. However, Z does continue in this direction. So Y to Z, because Z continues, that wouldn't be a line segment. That would actually be a ray because we have one stopping point where it doesn't keep going, and we have one side that does continue in one direction. So this is not a line segment. This is actually a ray. So we're going to check no. Now F is an angle, and it's saying X, Y, Z. So I'm just going to trace over that part. So this would be X, and then we've got to point Y in the middle, and then it continues with Z. So from X to Y to Z, that is an angle, because an angle is where 2 rays meet. So we've got a stopping and an arrow, and again a stopping point and an arrow. And they can be opened up in many different amounts. This one is opened up a little bit larger than the one that I drew, but that is an angle. Number 8, use geometry, words, and symbols to describe the rhombus shown. So we've got a rhombus here with A, B, C, and D, and each of these are points, A, B, C, and D. Now, if these are lines with 2 points on each end, they don't continue in both directions, they have 2 stopping points, so that makes it a line segment. So if we look at this shape, we've got a line segment from A to B because it stops here and it stops here. So that's one line segment. And then from B to C, that's 2 line segments. From C to D is a 3rd line segment. And from D to A is a 4th line segment. So this is a shape that is made up of 4 line segments. And then you could also name the 4 line segments. So we've got AB, and you would just put the line on top, no arrows, BC, CD, and DA. Number 9. Read the description of a shape below, then draw the shape at the right. So I'm going to read the whole description and then we'll draw it. It has 3 line segments. So this one had 4 line segments and it has 4 sides. So that tells me that our shape is going to have 3 line segments or 3 sides. Line segments RS and TR are the same length, and it has 1 square corner, which is angle R. So I'm going to start with that last part that it says it has 1 square corner, and I'm going to draw a square corner like that. And it says that's angle R, which means if this is an angle, R would be this point where they meet. So this point, this corner, would be labeled R. Now, if we go back, our 3 line segments are R to S, S to T, and T to R. Now, it says that R to S and T to R are the same length. So if this is R, we'll label this other end S, so that will make RS. Now, what we need to do is make our other segment TR the same length as this RS that we just drew. So R to S should be the same as TR. Now here's R, so we'll label this T, and I think these are about the same length. This one may need to be a tad longer, maybe not. As long as they are close to the same, that's okay. They don't have to be perfectly the same. So again, RS is here. TR would be this one. We've already got the R, which makes this top point, it has to be T. And it says those are the same length. And then we have 3 line segments. RS we already drew, that's along the bottom here. TR we already drew, that's this side part. And we remember these, it says they're about the same length, so we want those to be about the same. We've got our square corner down here. So we just have to connect S and T to make that 3rd line segment. And that would just be a connection of those 2 from S to T. It could be TS or ST because it's on the same line segment.